What I probably can't do is ignore the elephant in the room forever, which is that we have yet another case of Diane Abbott um, putting her foot in it, to say the least, right? So there was a column in the Observer recent or the Guardian recently, which was describing the fact that anti-black and anti-Asian racism is only part of the issues of racism in this country, and that we also actually one of the biggest the biggest groups of people who experience racism are Jewish people in Roma or whatever, and she had an absolutely ridiculous response to it, which we're going to read now. Racism is black and white. Tamia Owolade claims that Irish, Jewish, and traveller people all suffer from racism, in quotes. In the article, racism in Britain is not a black and white issue; it's far more complicated. They undoubtedly experience prejudice. This is similar to racism, and the two words are often used as if they're interchangeable. It is true that many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice, but they are not all their lives subject to racism. In pre-civil rights America, Irish people, Jewish people, and travellers were not required to sit at the back of the bus. In apartheid South Africa, these groups were not allowed to vote. At the height of slavery, there were no white-seeming people manacled on slave ships. Now, okay, let's analyze this, shall we? Right, so it's worth pointing out where a lot of this rhetoric does indeed come from, and there is a kind of academic definition of racism that some people will use, predominantly on the left, that there is like racism as a concept, the way it's kind of evolved originally, is born out of colonialism, right? In a pre-colonial era, the kind of racism that was experienced through the colonial period did not really exist, right? The example that you should compare it to is that in Rome, it didn't really matter what skin color people were, right? You're either a Roman or a barbarian based upon whether you're a Roman citizen or not, and that was the differential that they used. And then the colonial period marked the difference between the European, quote unquote, white people and the remainder of the people with different skin colours from around the world. And that was a basis of a lot of racism, and actually talks about, for example, things like segregation in America, slavery in the Americas as well, was born out of that colonial mindset, for example. Which is obviously, when you talk about Irish people, when Irish people were also colonised by the British, obviously it sounds a little bit tone deaf. I do not subscribe to this view of racism. I think it's silly and completely reductive, and doesn't really actually match onto um, the kind of ways in which people will use the word racism today. Like racism, like words are not prescriptive, right? They are descriptive. They describe the way people use them, and people always use the term racism to describe some kind of ethnic or racial or even ethno-religious kind of discrimination, and based on those grounds. Right? It's no doubt that the Jewish people, for example, in Nazi Germany, were explicitly targeted because of their race. For example, in those cases, that was a racial thing. It was racism. To say it's not racism because it doesn't quite fit into a weird kind of colonialized view of, or not a weird view, but a view on the structural racism that existed during colonialism. This doesn't really map on. So this is completely indefensible. This is complete. I don't. Leftoids are going to be incredibly tempted to try and defend this. Right? They're going to try and defend this. And it's not defensible, right? You can defend Diane Abbott as a person and say, this is her being silly, it's her being stupid, and that's fine. You can make those specific points. But to try and claim that this wasn't an incredibly poor thing for her to say, I'm sorry, let's just cope. You're absolutely coping because you've shown her ass again, in an incredibly obvious way. Like trying to compare the struggles of people like travelers and Jewish people in the UK to redheads, for example. Nonsense, complete nonsense, right? Now, obviously, her experience of how much anti-black racism that she's been subject to over the past however many years, that's obviously going to inform the way in which that she kind of views this stuff. And so that is going to be somewhat of a reason as to why she's been saying this stuff here, but that doesn't change the fact that it's optically horrendous for her, Labour, and specifically the Labour left, right? Coming out of a huge period in which anti-Semitism was used as a factional weapon, right, against the Labour left and the Labour Party in general by the Labour right and the mass media, to then essentially just say, well, actually, no, I can't be racist against Jewish people because no one can be racist against Jewish people. So really, that's not my problem. For example, when you know that you were literally a front bencher at the time, and so you were being seen as part of the kind of epicenter of why the anti-Semitism crisis happened in the first place. Something which is continually being used to skewer the Labour left specifically, so they hold no influence, or the left more generally. Right? It's not just the internal Labour Party politics. This is being used to devalue the opinions of. This is being used to try and devalue the opinions of the left wing entirely. Right? A left wing point gets made. That's similar to Corbyn. That's racist, for example. That's anti-Semitic. You can't do that. You're part of you're no longer allowed to be part of the discourse because of the history of anti-Semitism within the left, for example. Right? Obviously, a bunch of this stuff was completely fabricated and made up. We know, we've all seen the Labour files. But to then not properly actually think about the optics of the things that you do and don't say, or just the reality of the things that you do and don't say. You know, even if there's there's differences in the way that Jewish people and black people experience racism, right? The way that black people experience racism is people genuinely view them as inferior, right? I mean, that's the colonial mindset. The colonial mindset where that Europeans were specifically superior to black people, and that's why slavery was justified. And then, on top of that, conversely, with Jewish people, the racism is born out of fear. Usually, they get painted as a cabal of people in control, for example. Right? Obviously, that is mixed up along with some things that see them as non-European and inferior, whatever. But that's the kind of main thrust of anti-Semitism, because these things are different. A lot of people who only view things through these kind of material power dynamics, which I get, will refuse to properly, actually, fundamentally address the issues of racism that are faced by Jewish people, for example. What I'd like to point out, though, right, is that the response to this has been genuinely unhinged, right? And she's apologised now. There's actually, I think Deletion Quarter in chat brought this up in the John McTernan retweeted this, saying, swift and appropriate apology from Diane Abbott. She has been subjected to vile racist abuse of her career, and her apology should be accepted in the spirit that is offered, which, it's not a reasonable thing for him to say in response. But it's interesting he's only saying this now, right? Rather than what she said is way, way, way worse, right? Way worse than anything that Jeremy Corbyn said. Yet John McTernan was really happy to see Jeremy Corbyn completely hounded out the Labour Party. And yet his measured response here is completely out of character. It's almost like they're trying to save the ship, essentially, because they think it will look badly on Labour now that the EHRC period, right, they've given them the all clear, which apparently is not good enough for them now, which apparently means that now that all clear has been given, they're not within they have in the public eye excised the anti-Semites from the party. To then see this coming up is clearly they are using this. They clearly see that it damages their brand overall. But her response was this: I'm writing regarding my letter that was recently published in The Observer. I wish to wholly and unreservedly withdraw my remarks and dissociate myself from them. The errors arose in the initial draft being sent. There is no excuse, and I wish to apologise for any anguish caused. Racism takes many forms, and it is completely undeniable that Jewish people have suffered its monstrous effect, as have Irish people, travellers, and many others. Once again, I'd like to apologise publicly for remarks and any distress caused as a result of them, which is, again, a good apology, right? Absolutely a good apology. What I would like to actually cover, really, is that the response to this, what's interesting as well, is that she specifically, in the comment that she originally made, said that, the same racism that was felt by black people wasn't felt by Irish people, travellers, and Roma and Jewish people, for example. Yet all of the responses to these from the mainstream media, all the responses have been, look at her minimising the struggles of Jewish people. And they're like, oh, so did you conveniently missing or the Roma that she mentioned during the article, or the fact that it was originally responding to an article about how Roma people in this country face huge amounts of racism. It's almost like the mainstream media don't care about racism, or they don't care about Roma. They definitely don't care about racism against Roma, for example. And they fundamentally only see the anti-Semitism stuff as a way in which they can factionally attack the left. The fact that the mainstream media, even worse than the Labour right on this kind of stuff in response to Diane Abbott, it's absolutely mind-blowing. It really, really is. Which obviously, the press don't care about racism against anybody at all, really, unless they can use it as a factual weapon to attack people that they don't like. See, for example, all of the anti-Islamic stuff that's been completely normalised amongst the media. The fact that there's been no castigation for the Conservatives for their genuine institutional anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim rhetoric, that's completely endemic within conservative, not just the Conservative Party, but conservative politics in general, right? And also amongst the press, right? In the same way that the hierarchy of racism was uncovered by Martin Ford within the Labour Party, where anti-Semitism was given this pedestal above anti-Islamic racism and anti-black racism, and of course anti-Roma and traveller racism, for example. So the idea that somehow that the press just have this discerning eye to be able to pick up racism, except only to use that against Diane Abbott, is obviously incredibly hypocritical. Incredibly hypocritical. Yeah, all of the British media hate Roma. Yeah, 100%. And every single party, every single political party, apart from maybe the Green Party, will hate Roma as well. Racism against Romani people is the hip and cool racism in Europe, since you can't go after Jews anymore. Basically, you're absolutely right there, my rear end. And so this whole debacle has been an absolute nightmare, right? And for the press, again, for anybody who's working in the media, given how essentially racism was weaponized and used by the right and by the media as essentially a justification to be able to take people's eyes away from the misery of austerity, which led to a bunch of additional racism in the wake of people's falling living standards. To then suddenly cry foul about racism in general from any politician they don't like, obviously, is completely hypocritical, but it doesn't change the fact that Diane Abbott's in the wrong here. And also doesn't change the fact that they only really seem to care about anti-Semitism when it comes from the left specifically. When Liz Truss says anti-Semitic tropes, or when Steve Reed says anti-Semitic tropes, no coverage at all. No, like large-scale castigation. Like even David Baddiel was happy to castigate Liz Truss over her anti-Semitic tropes that she was saying. Coverage in the media? Nah, of course not. No coverage in the media whatsoever. So this is obviously being used as a factual weapon by the media to attack a black MP. But I do think that this is the end of the road, right? There's no coming back from this for Diane Abbott. Her reputation is already not great amongst the general wider public. She's not good optically for not just the Labour Party, but the left in general, right? As a figurehead for the left. And so I do think that Labour have no choice but to remove the whip. No choice to remove the whip from her. Like there's nothing else that they can do. They've been completely cornered by this. And I think she should, quite frankly, for her own mental health, right? For her own standard of living, she should step down as an MP, delete her Twitter account, retire, and enjoy her retirement, right? Because it's not doing her or her mental health or the left any favours for her to continue doing this. She's a liability, and she, quite frankly, has always been a little bit of a liability, even though I do think that a lot of the things she does are very good, and I very much admire the things she's done and the politics that she's fought for, and her story of being the first black MP in the country, for example. These are all very, very laudable things that she should absolutely always be given recognition for. But I don't think that she can continue. This is the end of the road. There's nothing else that you can do. In the wise words of the man being interviewed by the bus man, it's time to go. It's time to go. Time's up. If we want to, I think in general we need to move on from the old guard of the Labour left being the figureheads of the left movement in this country. We can't just continue staking our master people who, in the case of Jeremy Corbyn, have had his legacy and his public image completely tarnished in the media, basically with lies, quite frankly. And Diane Abbott, who does herself no favours at all. I think there's a lot. There needs to be a large scheme to move on. There needs to be new leaders, a young group of people who can speak to the concerns of young people in this country, to the concerns of marginalised groups in this country. And we need a new batch of people. And I think people like Zara Sultana, the Green Party in general, I've been pretty impressed with what they've been saying, and I'm going to be coming on to the Green Party later on today in the stream. There needs to be a changing of the guard somewhat, because I mean, there's a difference between Zara Sultana being smeared as an anti-Semite and Diane Abbott just saying stupid shit like this that, again, does her no favours at all. Does her literally zero favours and does the left no favours. No favours at all. And there are going to be some people going to try and try and defend this. And I think what we really need to do at this point is just, instead of trying to somehow whataboutism or double down on this, we just have to accept that some things are just never going to, some things are going to stick forever, and this one's going to stick forever. There's a difference, deletion quarter, between the kind of new deranged like agrocentrists who will try and specifically smear Zara Sultana with screenshots and slapdash evidence, than Diane Abbott writing it herself in the comments section in The Observer. Oh, also, I'm not going to support the Labour Party unless it's, of course, specifically Zara Sultana or Nadia Whittam or whatever. I am again. Well, the next segment I'm going to put up that I'm going to do at some point today, after we've had some filler content, I'm going to talk about why I support the Greens and why people should vote for the Greens specifically. But the thing is that the Corbyn's response to the EHRC report was correct. He was correct in doing so, and Diane Abbott is just completely wrong here. Completely wrong. Right? There may be some kind of theoretical grounding, and I can understand why she's saying the things that she's saying, but A, she's got to be smarter than what she's doing here, which she clearly hasn't been. And B, she just needs to, there has to be a more nuanced discussion about how we deal with the issues of racism in this country, and it has to be less myopic than the kind of stuff that Diane Abbott was saying here, really and truly. And it's a shame, because this will then be used additionally to attack Jeremy Corbyn for the completely manufactured claims that he was somehow anti-Semitic as part of the Labour Party, when he wasn't. Like, there was nothing, Corbyn never did anything anti-Semitic. It was all smears, it was all lies, it was all deception. But now they can always say, oh, he was good friends with Diane Abbott, who has said something that could be construed as anti-Semitic and was also condemned as well, right? It's not good enough. It's just not good enough. And I worry for her specifically. I think over half of the abuse directed at MPs online is directed specifically at her. And I don't think that's good for her. Maybe I'm being, maternalistic here, but I just think that for her own mental health, she's got to call it a day. I think she has to call it a day. And we can go on all about the way that racist staffers in the Labour Party were paid off, which is true, or that Islamophobia and anti-black racism aren't being properly addressed in the Labour Party, which is true, or within the media, which is all true, right? That doesn't change the fact that what Dan Abbott said here was wrong. Anyway, speaking of left always trying to defend this, there is a segment in LBC where Ash Sarkar was speaking to Sangeeta Miska about this kind of stuff, and I'll be interested to see Ash's perspective. I've not heard this yet. It's been my first reaction, so let's have a look.
I think the first thing to say is that the letter is totally indefensible. It's wrong, and it's factually and historically wrong. We can measure the kinds of racist discrimination that the groups that she identified have experienced throughout history and also to the present day. And we don't.
Also, what's interesting as well is using this definition where it's all based around skin colour rather than general acts of prejudice against people from different ethnic backgrounds. Did Diane Abbott just forget that Roma aren't white, and that large portions of the Jewish community aren't white either, depending whether Ashkenazi or Sephardic, whatever it might be, for example, right? If you're only just specifically talking about the idea that racism is specifically about the kind of skin color differentials between Europe and the rest of the world, this legacy of colonialism, then even then, there are groups of Jewish people and the entire Roma community which are all non-white, for example.
Don't need every form of racism to be exactly the same for it to be racism. So, for example, I am a South Asian woman. Now, it means that some forms of discrimination which disproportionately impact, for instance, Black people won't affect me in the same way, but that doesn't mean I'm not a victim of other kinds of racism. And you can have that discussion. You can talk about these differences amongst how racism is experienced without saying that one isn't racism, one is merely prejudice. And I think that Diane Abbott, as you mentioned, has been a lifelong campaigner against racism. She's also been somebody who has experienced some of the most vicious and grotesque forms of racism in contemporary politics, and you would hope that somebody like her would know better.
It's interesting you bring up the Rachel Riley's I don't look Jewish context with comments, which is obviously fucked up. You're absolutely right. But specifically in the context of the fact that she was the one kind of spearheading like the actual smear campaign against people like Jeremy Corbyn. It was interesting how the remainder of the white people, the non Jewish white people who specifically weaponized this stuff to attack the Labour Party at the time, immediately latched onto Rachel Riley, probably almost because of the fact that she was seen as the acceptable face of Judaism in their eyes, for example. Because a lot of these people probably do have some kind of deep-seated unconscious bias against Jewish-looking people too. Again, in-group, out-group stuff. There's a lot of kind of unconscious anti-Semitism in general in this country, which would be based upon appearance. Rachel Riley's fellow Aryan comment too, right? I know, yeah, exactly. She is an absolute weapon.
Than to diminish or minimize the experiences of travellers, Irish people, and Jewish people.
Do you know what, Ash? Actually, when I saw the letter initially, it was really for that reason that I couldn't quite believe that she had put pen to paper, or virtual pen to paper, and written those words, because
I've seen multiple people in my chat today. I've seen multiple people in chat today say that Diane Abbott isn't stupid. She must have been doing this for some reason. I hate to break it to you. She is not smart, right? She may have been smart previously, but as she's aged, her mental faculties have deteriorated somewhat, right? That obviously, this is not something that happens to all old people, for example. I mean, she's only 69, right? She's not exactly old. But she's clearly not the smartest cookie, at least not recently. And I just think this was completely nonsensical. I think that she just didn't know she didn't really understand the gravitas of what she was writing and how she wrote it. If she wasn't being stupid with these comments, she would have phrased it in a less not just incorrect, but embarrassingly incorrect way. Like, if you're not an idiot, why would you compare any kinds of racism to the prejudice from that redheads feel? Like, come on.
We know that Diane Abbott, I think at one point, was receiving more racial hate mail than every MP put together in the House of Commons. It's mind-boggling.
I'm not saying that necessarily takes away from her political positions that you know full well, Deletion Quarter, but I 100% agree with, right? And I will always engage on her takes on their own merit rather than discounting them because it's Diane Abbott and she's stupid, which is what centrists will do. But to claim that she has somehow come in any way is somehow like a thought leader amongst like left-wing people, I just don't buy that. I just don't buy that at all.
And I mean, this is why there has to be an investigation into what happened.
Well, and also, she's not the Dianne Feinstein of UK politics, right? Let's not say things we can't take back. No one is anyway. Nowhere near. Like, Dianne Feinstein forgets that she has to go and be able to vote for specific bills, or will try and vote twice because she forgets whether she's voted for a bill in the first place. That is incredibly mean, and just incorrect to try and say that Diane Abbott being not the smartest cookie compared to Dianne Feinstein, who literally has fucking dementia. Come on.
Because what we would all hope is that this was just some really, tragically clumsy phrasing, and as soon as it went out there and as soon as she saw,
no one placed her as the thought leader. She was on the front bench, Deletion Quarter. It was a silly decision. She's like one thing that I know you say that to be continually optics pilled is cucked, and I do agree that continually being optics pilled is kind of cuck behavior. But there's just basic stuff, right? And you have to have your best looking people to be front and center of your movement. And having Diane Abbott on your front bench, no, it's not a good idea, not a good plan.
Or how her words were being received, that she was, filled with regret and embarrassment. And of course, people do make mistakes, but there has to be an investigation that gets to the bottom of it. And I think that when it comes to the issue of suspending the whip pending an investigation, that's got to be the rule for everybody. If you've got it for one person, that's got to be the rule for everybody who's being investigated over matters like these in the Labour Party.
Why do you think it's not? You're implying that it's not the rule for everyone.
Well, it has been in some cases. So with the instance of Neil Coyle, for instance, who was accused of racism by a lobby journalist. You also had the instance of Rupa Huck, who had said that Kwasi Kwarteng was only superficially black. Now, what ended up happening in those two cases was different. Neil Coyle still has...
And again, it just shows quite frankly, as always, every time these issues come up, I've said it in the segment previously, and I will say it again: the racism that is felt by Roma, by Muslims, by Black people in this country is continually undermined by our media. For example, continually undermined, where comments like Neil Calls and Ruba Hux get swept under the rug. Will have 5 minutes of coverage and then completely ignored after that, or the endemic anti-Islamic racism in the Conservative Party that never ever gets addressed right. Saida Varsi literally screaming at the top of her lungs for years, completely ignored. Trojan Horse, Michael Gove, like literally creating a state-mandated witch hunt against Muslims, off the back of lies that he knew were lies, is like a massive story amongst terminally online leftards like myself. Mainstream media coverage, nothing. In fact, the mainstream media specifically repudiated the Trojan Horse stuff because the New York Times got there first, right? The New York Times got there first, so the British press, the British media establishment, Guardian included, or the whole lot of them, just completely ignored it and completely undermined it because they felt slighted by the fact that the Americans were criticizing us and our lack of media standards. It's embarrassing. It's always embarrassing. Do you think if I convert tomorrow to Islam or Judaism, I face the same difficulties as some Black in the UK? Well, yeah, exactly. You're absolutely right. And you are correct in saying the nuggets of truth and what she was saying in the statement that she made. And that we need to think about these problems in an intersectional manner between the levels with which people are going to see it within a white supremacist society. Those get completely undermined because she was so bad and actually conveying her point, or not making her point look incredibly nonsensical because it wasn't worded particularly well, or B, completely ridiculous in that she tried to compare it to the prejudice that people feel if they get for having red hair, for example. Again, it's whatever truth was in there that I do agree with you about the way in which skin color does factor into white supremacy, of the legacy of colonialism, as I was mentioning before. Any truth to that is immediately gone because of how poorly phrased it was, especially given the context.
Had the whip suspended, but Rupa Huck has had the whip returned to her, and she's had the whip returned to her because she's shown real contrition and growth and self-examination. So for me, it's much less a case of going, okay, once somebody's got the whip removed, that's it. It's going, okay, well, if someone's shown that they've grown, is there a way back? And I would hope that there would be for Diane Abbott. She's somebody who I think has made some incredible contributions to politics, and you would hope that she would be willing to learn and to grow and examine herself.
I think that's a really good that is a good response to. I think I agree fully with what Ash was saying there, and about this does frame the way in which we view these kind of incidents in a specific light as well, and that people should just accept the apology, right? They should accept the apology, and it's very clear that though if there was a point to be made, it wasn't being made because she is anti-Semitic, for example, which is what the press are going to try and paint this as, but because she poorly worded a point about the nature of white supremacy in the UK. But that's all, that's not going to work out. We're not going to be able to get to that same discussion now because it was just easy ammunition for the right-wing press and the right wing of the Labour Party. Also, it doesn't really matter. As your right-wing, again, as I mentioned before, the Labour Party are trying to defend this stuff because they feel like it damages their brand value, if you can imagine such a thing for the Labour right. The GRT community are seen as less than human. That's the sad reality. Well, yeah, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. They're literally, like, people like Suella Braverman are happy to deperson the GRT community and essentially paint them as non-desirables in the most kind of blatantly actually fascistic rhetoric that I've seen over the past however many years, which the racism has been massively ramped up by the Home Office from the Conservative government. People always talk about the kind of fascist stuff that she's doing, overruling the equality and the European Court of Human Rights, and what she's doing with the stop the boats kind of stuff. And that is obviously, there are lots of fascistic rhetoric in there, but nothing comes close to the level of kind of basic eliminationist rhetoric that people like, not just Suella Braverman, but the Labour Party, as you said, which put in their own leaflets about the ways in which the GRT community have essentially been kind of hit with soft genocide rhetoric at this point, which is obviously fucking monstrous and is the absolute lowest of the low. But the problem is that this is the political consensus amongst the press, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and then a bunch of other parties as well. They are seen as non-people, and the fact that none of this is being even mentioned at all, right? None of this is being mentioned. And of course, Diane Abbott was trying to, and in her article, in her response to the article, she even underplayed this too, by saying that these people weren't subject to the same kind of racism that black people face. And I would argue that, right, the systemic, on a kind of systemic level as far as legislation is concerned, Roma and the GRT community are absolutely the people who have been hit with the most racism in recent times. Obviously, societal generalized racism is going to come from place of white supremacy, and that's never going to change. And there is very specific and poignant and nasty racism, and the black people and Asian people specifically feel in the UK, based upon a legacy of colonialism. But on a legislative level, literally being depersoned by the state, and treated as undesirables it's naked fascism the GRT faces in the UK. The article she was responding to, which will get no pushback with racist dog shit, an attempt to deny systemic anti-black racism in the UK. Well, that's again frustrating, is that if she'd worded her response better, we could have had a much better conversation about the failures of the article too, which is a shame. Because, again, anti-black racism in this country, again, does not get the attention that it deserves. And the problem is that the way in which the traveller community is dealt with by the state will lead to a further combative relationship with the state, which will then be used as a justification for more fascist policy making against them. It's as simple as that. So this is the original article. Let me have a look. She argues that the UK is immeasurably far from being a racially just society, all kinds of inequality which would not be there if it really was a just society, blah, blah, blah. The standard progressive response would be that the awful is not surprising. We all know that we live in a racist society. Anyone who denies this is deluded and complicit with racism. Any racial abuse against any individual is morally abhorrent, and the civil society has a moral duty to oppose prejudice, etc., etc. The case report affirmed the existence of institutional racism, but the Evidence for Equality National Survey report complicates some of the underlying assumptions that many ostensibly progressive people espouse on racial equality in Britain. One has a narrow idea of what constitutes racism. Anyone who is white is privileged, we are told, and racism only affects people of colour. But no. Like, this is just complete misunderstanding of how whiteness is constructed and how systemic racism is intersectional, right? Most progressive people specifically have an intersectional discussion of racism, which is what we should be having, which is that there are some systemic things that are based upon skin colour, some other kinds that are based upon other ethnic or religious backgrounds, for example. These intersect but are not the same thing, and can be felt for different degrees. But there is a very specific and pernicious legacy of a colonialist racism, which specifically views people on skin colour that no white people will ever experience. It's not saying that everyone who is white is specifically privileged and racism only affects people of colour. This is a completely reductive take from the original writer of this article. So yeah, it does look like this article is not something that I would agree with. I'd need to read more through. The thing is, what's interesting as well is that, there's the two most racialized, the two groups in this survey that this person is quoting here that experience the most racism are traveller communities and other black people as well. So I don't know how you'd be able to average out black Caribbean and mixed people from other black African. I don't know how you'd be able to get a full figure for people who are part of that general kind of racial group, but interesting. Now, is Starmer going to be booted out of the Labour Party for dog whistle racism against Sunak and other brown men, suggesting they are whole groomers? Again, of course, Starmer will face zero pushback from the media or from the public scrutiny in general, right? For the racial undertones of the posters. They were saying, oh, it's gutter politics, it's sewer politics, which obviously it was, and saying the personalized attacks on Rishi Sunak are bad, which all of those are points that I agree with. Does the press ever talk about the fact that it was specifically dog whistling towards the whole grooming gang type stuff and the racism that is being felt by Asian communities in this country because of the grooming gang stuff that was being used to attack Rishi Sunak and those demographics specifically? Of course they won't. Of course they won't cover that, of course. You know what they won't cover? You know who Labour aren't going to suspend from the Labour Party? Those whip isn't going to get removed for blatant bigotry, right? Rosie fucking Duffield, right? Diane Abbott has the whip removed over a poorly worded letter in The Observer. Rosie Duffield likes Holocaust denial on Twitter, right? Holocaust denial as judged by German courts, right? German courts have ruled that denying that trans people were attacked by the Nazis during the Holocaust is Holocaust denial, right? From the country that would fucking know. Does Rosie Duffield lose the whip? Of course she fucking doesn't, right? Rosie Duffield is allowed to spew as much transphobic bigotry as she likes. Is there any pushback from the lady leadership? No. Is there any pushback from the media? No. Of course there fucking isn't. It's almost like there's a hierarchy of bigotry in this country that people don't want to recognise. And also, please like, comment, and subscribe. Please comment calling me a beta soy-pilled cuck in the comments for acknowledging the existence of racism. Please do.